Yeah?
More or less.
She might want to elaborate on that and make it correct. But, so she's come to watch our debates through an organisation called Understanding Animal Research, who are a charity involved in this debate.
Hello and welcome to this year's first debate. My speech will be the shortest and the easiest to follow. So the topic today, this house would ban all forms of animal research. We have 4 teams, including 2 academics. They are Naomi, Flavia, and the John Tsopanis and John Gray for the motion, and Thomas Schafranek, Soila, Apparicio, Charlie Evans, and our History of Modern Political Ideas teacher, Joanne, against the motion. We will have a quick vote before the debate begins so that we see what everyone thinks at this point, and then a quick vote afterwards, and a session of questions and answers after the debaters finish their speeches. So if we could please vote now. Who believes that this house should ban all forms of animal research? Could you please raise your hand? 1, 2, 3. Okay. And who is against the motion? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8. Okay. I'm not taking into consideration the debaters themselves. Okay, so could we have Naomi? Yeah. Oh, sorry, just one quick thing. We will have points of information coming from the teams, but only for the last 4 speeches. So not for the last 6 speeches, not for the first 2. They are between the 2nd and the 4th minute.
So, our team will argue that we should ban all forms of animal research, but I'm going to kick off here by saying some reasons why we should treat animals as proper objects of moral concern at all, and I'll leave it to some of the others to make the final decisive claim about all forms of animal research being banned. Okay, so in reaction to the existence of animal research, it's often pointed out by its defenders that they are, after all, only animals. So I want to raise initially the point that we are animals too, and to say that they are only animals is hopeless. We're animals too. A little more sophisticated, it may be pointed out that they are other species. We are human beings. They are rats or something. But here there is a real concern that the opponents will fall into speciesism. So this is the position that Peter Singer sums up. Is that a violent reaction to the Oh, okay. Okay. So speciesism is discrimination against or exploitation of animal species by human beings based on the bare assumption of human superiority. The danger of this sort of bare assumption of superiority, moral superiority, is evident when we look back through history and see how, as Singer points out, racists gave greater weight to the interests of members of their own race, where there was a clash between their interests and the interests of those of another race. Sexists favoured the interest of their own sex. Similarly, speciesists allow the interests of their own species to override the greater interests of members of other species. The pattern is identical in each case. So to rely on a bare assertion of the fact that the animals being tested on other species seems to fall into a mode of argument that's been used in the past to justify forms of discrimination that we would now consider completely unacceptable. Okay then. However, the opponents might indeed suggest that there are some features of human beings that make them superior, and that therefore it isn't a bare assertion of species superiority, but rather a rational assertion of it. So the two that I think are most likely are that humans have a capacity for rationality that lifts us above other species and that makes it more appropriate to treat us as objects of moral concern. The other is that humans have a capacity to experience pleasure or pain. Now, I think both of those are bad kinds of arguments for our opponents to use, but I'm going to just say a couple of words on each. So, capacity for rationality, sure, that probably separates us from most other animals. However, it's dangerous to accord moral concern on the basis of rationality, insofar as babies, people, adults with mental disabilities, and all sorts of other human beings that we would naturally suppose are worthy of moral concern would be chucked out too. So one would throw out the baby with the bathwater if one made the whole case for moral concern for human beings on the basis of rationality. Okay, secondly, capacity to experience pleasure or pain. John Stuart Mill, so I guess it would be generally understood that other animals can feel pleasure and pain. Now, John Stuart Mill would argue that the human capacities for pleasure and pain are higher and somehow more significant than animal capacities for pleasure and pain. However, I think that either that falls into, that may fall into the baby in the bathwater trap, because perhaps you would associate the higher pleasures and pains with the rationality, and we've already established that would be dangerous. Or if it doesn't fall into that trap, I actually think, in any case, the higher intellectual capacities that human beings might be supposed to have could work against according moral significance to their pleasure and pain. Certainly, I think that the fact that human beings are able to understand the purposes for which they're put into pain might make the pains more bearable than the animals that are unable to understand why they're in that pain. Okay. Nothing I've said here suggests the need for an absolute rule against testing on animals. It suggests, though, I think, that we should err on the side of avoiding it. We should treat animals as having equal or close to equal moral worth as us, and their pain therefore being important. My colleagues will be developing the argument decisively for an absolute ban after me.
My team will be arguing against a ban on animal testing. And I want to start by asking you a question, recalling in your own mind. If you've ever tested out a recipe, how'd it work out? Good? Bad? Did you save any lives while you were doing it? Probably not. It might have been a good recipe, I don't really know. And probably, if you're one of the approximately 97% of the population, that recipe involved either meat or animal products, which means that an animal either suffered or died in order for you to test out that recipe. And we're being asked today to defend the ability to test life-saving medications, the ability to know our bodies and animals' bodies better through testing. It's no question that millions of lives have been saved through animal testing over time. We better understand our respiratory system, the circulatory system, because of animal testing. We understand psychological conditioning and how the mind works. Cloning is being developed into organ generation. And the very idea of having a vaccine, let alone the many that have been produced, but the very idea of having a vaccine comes from animal research. And of course, insulin, which is essential for allowing people with diabetes, the 3 million people in the UK who have diabetes, to live full and long lives, comes from animal testing. And of course, we've made major strides in fighting tuberculosis, AIDS, polio, leprosy, the list goes on. My colleague on the opposing team has made the point that there's moral decisions going on in this, that we think that maybe animals are not worthy of moral concern, but this is of course not the case. Animals are helped through animal research as well. This is not just about using animals to help ourselves. Veterinary science relies on animal testing to save millions of animal lives. And And of course my colleague said, she's exactly right, nothing in what she said actually justifies an absolute ban on animal testing. There are details to be worked out in what she said. We have to consider that they are moral beings, and their pleasure and pain is considered. So there's the why we do animal testing. It benefits both humans and animals, but also the how. And that's what my colleagues on my team will also be expanding upon, is how we do animal testing. The issue of pleasure and pain is completely addressed, as my colleagues will tell you. There are regulations on animal testing that consider animals as moral beings. And my colleagues will tell you more about that. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Every 8 seconds, an animal used in animal research dies. By the time I finish this sentence, an animal used in animal research would have already died. Is this not morally disturbing to you, ladies and gentlemen? The opposition has pointed out that animal research is highly efficient at preventing certain disease or curing certain diseases that affect humans. Actually, I'd just like to start with a bit of rebuttal and show some statistics that counter-argue that. So, the British Medical Association has reported that adverse reactions to prescription drugs kill more than 100,000 humans every single year. And that clearly shows that animal tests fail to predict these dangers. And this is actually not surprising because animals are unable to relate the most common side effects that occur with prescription medicines such as headaches or dizziness or depression or nausea. So therefore, these symptoms are often the initial warning signs of more severe problems. So therefore, we can say that they're not actually that efficient, they're not very efficient in preventing diseases such as the ones mentioned by the opposition team. Secondly, I'd just like to reiterate the point. No, thank you. I'd like to reiterate the point that our team has made, that animals have a right not to be harmed. There are differences between us and animals, but also there are many similarities. Animals recoil from pain. They appear to express a fear of torment. They appear to take pleasure in activities, and it's clear that we're very similar to them in so many ways. And any animal sharing their anatomical, physiological, and behavioural characteristics is very likely to have feelings like us. And if we accept as true, that as true for the sake of argument, that all humans have a right not to be harmed, simply by virtue of existing as being of moral worth, then we must ask ourselves, what makes animals so different? They experience pain just like we do. If animals can feel what we feel, they suffer what we suffer, is it right to discriminate them just on the basis that we are the superior species, just because we have rationality? Secondly, I'd like to point out that animal research necessitates significant harm to the animals involved. For instance, right now, millions of mice, rats, rabbits, cats and dogs and other animals are locked inside cold, barren cages in laboratories across the whole country. They languish in pain, they ache with loneliness, they long to roam free, and instead all they can do is sit and wait in fear of the next terrifying and painful experience that will be performed on them. Do they have a choice in the matter? No, they don't. Mice and rats are daily forced to inhale toxic fumes, dogs are forced to have pesticides, rabbits are forced to have corrosive chemicals rubbed onto their skins and eyes. And studies show that mice are actually capable of empathy for other mice and become even more stressed when witnessing what the other mice... Yes?
You said that dogs and rabbits are harmed. Actually, the law strictly dictates that small animals such as rats and mice should be used if possible. Do you agree?
I do agree, but it still doesn't... The point is that although the law says that, the fact that those animals will still experience pain is undeniable. Also, I'd like to point out in 2009, an undercover lab investigation revealed monkeys frantically spinning around their cages, biting open bones, mutilating themselves, and this is called stress-induced psychosis. Laboratories are literally driving these animals crazy. Is this right? Is this morally right just because we think we're better than them, just because this saves human lives? There are 150 million animals using the status quo, and even if the opposition counter-argument that states that animals lack the capacity to truly suffer is believed, this should not be an argument, ladies and gentlemen, because the outcome is that those animals ultimately end up dying. And lastly, I'd just like to point out there are some groups of people that have less capacity for suffering than most animals. So we can talk about people in vegetative states. We can talk about babies who don't develop consciousness until like 8 days after their birth. We can talk about people who have impairment. Are we going to use research on those people solely on the basis that they're not as rational as other people, solely on the basis that we can, solely on the basis that they have no choice in the matter? No, because it would be morally wrong. What justifies us doing the same to animals? I'm not very sure. And lastly, I'd just like to point out there are a few experiments and I'd just like to give you a sense of the cruelty that's used against animals. So we have Yale University School of Medicine, where researchers immobilise mice and rats in tubes. They shock their feet, suspending them by their tails, force them to swim to avoid drowning. This is just irrelevant research that is claimed to have relevance for human anxiety and human depression, but actually it has no proof that it does. So overall, I'd just like to summarise that it's wrong to conduct animal research for 3 main reasons. Firstly, it's the animals have a right not to be harmed. Secondly, necessitates significant harm to the animals involved. And some group of people have less capacity for suffering than most animals. That does not justify it. Thank you very much. Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to begin by rebutting the arguments that the opposition made. It was stated that we suggested that suffering is a necessity, and that was not stated by our speaker. We do agree that suffering is wrong, and we agree that animals should not be locked up in cages where acid is rubbed onto their eyes in order for us to benefit from some form of research. So we do agree that it is wrong. However, there are laws in this country and in the EU and in America that state, well, first of all, 3 licenses have to be held in order for animal research to be conducted. Secondly, it is illegal to use animal testing where other alternative methods can provide an equal and just as valid answer and outcome to the animal research. Animal research is not used in cosmetic testing, and that has been banned since 1994. So,
information? Do you believe then that just because animals are not allowed in cosmetics testing, that justifies giving them Parkinson's and Huntington's disease to treat those diseases?
The argument, which I will move on to, and which was mentioned, John Stuart Mill, in that a utilitarian argument is that we look at the benefits for many people as opposed to benefits for the few. And I'd like to point out on that note that in our entire lifetime, 4 mice, 1 rat, or less than 1 rat and less than 1 fish is used for our entire medical research needs. So in the grand scheme of things, not a huge amount of animals aren't used for our personal research, personal capacity. With regards to animals on a moral level, and which I'd like to move at this point as well, is that we are, and the argument that we are all animals, we are superior beings because we have evolved to be so. And the fact is, if there was a baby on a track line, a train track line, and a rat on a train track line, we would be inclined, it would be weird not to save the rat or not to save the baby. We would save the baby, and it would be okay. No one would judge you for saving the rat as opposed to saving the baby.
Don't you think that's sort of a discrimination based on species? They have every right to live, the rat has every right to live just like the baby does.
In one sense, yes, because a baby and a rat have similar levels of moral capacity. But a human baby has a greater capacity for expansion. A baby can develop, a baby can contribute to society. It has opportunities to contribute to society, to develop for a better society, whereas a rat can only save, although a rat can be used for medical research and save lives, a rat is not essential for developing, in a sense, human society. With regards to human reaction to description drugs, again, with all the laws considered, or that have to be considered with regards to saving, or all the laws in place for minimal suffering of animals is essential in opposing your argument that a huge amount of suffering is involved when it's not. And actually, animals are given painkillers, they're given anaesthesia so that they suffer in a minimal way. I would like to finish by saying that humans are superior in that we do empathise with animals, and we value human life in the sense of, again, it proves a capacity for human cognitive thought, which Americans, which animals, that was really bad, which animals don't have at the same level as humans. The benefits far outweigh the inconveniences. It relieves not only human pain, but animal pain and suffering with regards to veterinary medicine. And we are always researching for alternatives to animal research. As I said, animal research is not used, but other forms of research can be used. That's a very good way to finish.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to point out two things that have gone in this debate. So first of all, I'd like to identify kind of the moral level in which this debate is taking place. And then second of all, I want to talk a little bit about the pragmatics, which the opposition have highlighted. First, I'd like to start with a little bit of rebuttal to Soila, who made some lovely points. But your point about utilitarianism kind of falls on our side. Why? Well, we've already pointed out to you that 115 million animals die every single year due to animal research. Now, that's incremental, so that's every year. Now let's take animal research over the last 30 years, it's been like the gold standard, it's plateaued. If you do the maths, that's like 3 billion animals that have died in the last 30 years. No, thank you. And if you're going to take a utilitarian point of view, can we argue that 3 billion humans have been saved in that time? Well, animal research is essentially quite a very small part of what is larger medical research. If you're going to take a utilitarian point of view, and Naomi's already pointed out the dangers of speciesism, well, we weigh up our 3 billion animals that have been harmed in animal research, and then we look at it and we say, well, the utilitarian argument doesn't hold, and if it does hold, it holds on our side. No thank yous. There are two things we want to point out. First, we talked about morality, so Naomi started. She goes, is it wrong to harm animals? Can we distinguish between humans and animals? And we haven't really heard an argument on the other side why that's not true. So I think we've come to kind of a general conclusion that speciesism is a bad thing, but it's the pragmatics that's the real issue. So what the real question in this debate is the harm caused to animals doing research outweighed by the benefits they cause? Well, if we take a utilitarian point of view, no, we're not going to argue that. So we want to say, first of all, that apart from being morally wrong, animal research is good for the progression of science. So over the last 30 years, animal research has been kind of like the gold standard. It's plateaued. The way that it works is animals are given diseases, and then vaccines or treatments are figured out, and then they're given to these things. So at KCL around the corner, they've got 15 little South American monkeys, and they inject them with Parkinson's, and then they try a load of different vaccines, and then after 2 years, these animals are put down. So we think that's kind of like a really costly, ineffective, and just unnecessary form of research. It's not specific enough to justify that level of confinement. And the reason is we have alternatives. These alternatives are, over the last 10, 20 years, we've had massive advancements in technology. We now have, no thank you, massively powerful computers. We know the chemical structure of most components, and we can manufacture now live animal and human tissue that we can now experiment on, which is really, really important because this is rapidly developing technology. We saw last couple of months that the first genetically engineered burger was made inside a lab. We're cultivating real human and animal tissue. But what does every rapidly developing technology need? Money to help it grow. Now, if we impose this ban straight off, we can direct that money into developing these technologies that we believe are more effective in treating these issues. Why is that good? Well, if we put money into these new technologies, we'll have better and more effective forms of research than currently exist. Why? Well, we've already identified that using vaccines on animal tissue and then transferring them to humans is not necessarily the most effective way of developing a vaccine. We'd be much better if we had human tissue on hand and we could try out these things. No, thank you. And we wouldn't have the side effects. And then secondly, we'd probably have like a morally functional outlet of research where we can use non-conscious tissue rather than conscious human beings. Now, of course, now the opposition will say this is impossible, it will take forever, we need them now. But do the math, right? We believe that, if, let's say that we're trying to cure Parkinson's, we're trying to cure Huntington's disease. You've got 15 monkeys in the lab. You can only test 15 vaccines at a time. It takes years and years. But with proper research and proper investment, we can have 1,000 live tissue cultures that we can test 1,000 vaccines on, which will be much more effective. No, thank you. In a time of crisis. Now, why is that important? Well, like when the zombie apocalypse comes along, time might be like a really important thing when coming to deal with a particular disease, the spread of AIDS. When these issues become a pandemic, time is a real important factor, and you just can't manufacture that type of scale with animals. We're saying if you put the money into this new technology, you can manufacture to that scale, and you can address these issues quickly. That's really, really important. So we don't think there's... No, yes, please.
It takes a while to develop these new technologies. It's suggesting that you're going to take the money out of current animal research which has been used to fund cancer drugs. Would you therefore find it okay to take away this research that is being used for development of cancer and put it into these new technologies which will take a lot longer to find these outcomes?
No, well, first of all, like animal research is a very small part of medical research, so these research would still go on, but in a more organic form. Second of all, there are already the foundations of these technologies that can be developed, so that waiting time isn't that large. We've already pointed out that human stem cells and human tissues are being cultivated in labs, so that time difference isn't that huge. So basically what we've shown you today, we've shown you that morally, well, species is a bad thing, we shouldn't discriminate against animals. Second of all, we're giving you a practical alternative, that this money will be able to advance already existing technologies and help the animal cause. And then thirdly, why is this good for society as a whole? Well, here's the thing. Over the last 30 years, we've had massive movements towards equality, against a less prejudiced, less sexist, less racist, less homophobic society. No one in this room is probably going to argue that speciesism is a worse crime than racism, but if the government step in and put an outright ban on speciesism right now, that sets a massive precedent in society where racism and sexism won't be tolerated, and again, that's another great benefit that comes down on our side. And we
I think I'm going to slow down the pace a little bit. So, animal rights. I'm going to start with speciesism, because a lot was said about speciesism, especially the fact that it was based on the bare assumption of superiority, and that bare assumption in the case of racism was indeed bare. We knew very little, white people knew very little about black people, and just assumed for their benefit that black people were inferior. Now today we have much better scientific methods of knowing that the human cognitive capacity is much, much superior to those of animals. And to prove that, we have the fact that these four people are actually worried about the welfare of animals, whereas animals on the other side would just be lions devouring them, rats nibbling at their toes, etc. So we have live evidence in this room of humans actually having more life value than animals, and that's why we should protect human life with animal research, and protect animal life with animal research. Take the example of a very rational squirrel, the only one in the world. This rational squirrel would think to himself, am I going to kill these humans who might potentially create a drug that's going to save me and my family for the future? Or am I going to kill that squirrel over there, who can be tested, in order to be able to save the lives of humans who will then be able to create more drugs to save more squirrels? This rational squirrel, bear in mind, would nibble at your toes. Okay, I find that argument is humorous, but it combines the ideas that we've mentioned, that humans are rational, more rational than animals, and better yet, that rationality enables us to care for animals and for humans, not just for humans. Okay, we mentioned licenses, and I want to add to that the fact that these laws are also an example of humans caring for animals. And we've also mentioned that a lot of animals have been tortured and torn apart, and 3 billion animals have died, apparently. I'd like to question whether those 3 billion animals died in the UK, where we have stringent laws about animal testing. Crucially, the fact that animals are only used when extremely necessary for medical progress. So JT went into great detail about how we have fake flesh that's going to enable us to create drugs. That's true, but it doesn't go all the way. We can't create all the medical research that we would want to with this fake flesh. That's why we use animals, and there are laws to ensure that that fake flesh can't do the job instead of putting these animals at risk. And that's why I think that animal research is extremely important.
Okay, thank you, Charlie, for your speech. I'm going to start with a couple of points of rebuttal, mostly on the arguments that the human cognitive capacity and their increased capacity to suffer in particular makes them more worthy of consideration, and also the idea that humans being moral agents deserve moral consideration, whereas animals, if they're not acting morally, don't. Okay. And the first of that, the fact that human cognitive capacity is greater and they can suffer more, that may well be true, but just because you're now arguing for a lesser harm doesn't make that harm inherently more justified than the greater harm, okay? What we're saying is that causing unconsensual suffering on an animal that doesn't understand why it's being caused to suffer in the first place, or a person, if it was that in that case, is not acceptable in any way, shape or form. As for the moral argument that humans...
More information.
No, thank you. That humans are inherently more worthy of ethical consideration because they can understand these arguments. Again, that puts things like human rights on a very shaky ground because not all humans are capable of understanding moral arguments. Humans in a vegetative state, humans with mental problems that mean that they can't engage in that form of contract. I want to build a moral framework which will prevent us from having really to accept experimentation on humans who cannot suffer as much as some animals, or which will either, we don't want to, so I sort of lost my train of thought there a bit, or whatever. We want to develop a morally consistent framework that will not lead to us having to test on humans with less cognitive capacity. We also want it to be fully consistent, okay? We don't want to have to just justify why we don't test on these humans based on their species, because Naomi explained in great detail why speciesism is actually a very tenuously defendable principle, okay? So, if you accept that we must consider animal suffering as a moral consideration, which I don't think that many of the speakers have really done, except for just then Charlie. But the first half of the debate didn't see much discussion at that point. We then have to look at the implications of this argument. And as I just said, there's basically three options, okay? You can either test on animals and not on people. That's logically inconsistent, and it makes it kind of hard for us now to justify why we're so concerned about this train of thought, okay? Secondly, we can experiment on both humans and animals. That, I don't think, is a desirable outcome, because now we're testing on humans and as well as animals, we just increased what we're testing on. I don't like it. Third outcome, okay, which is consistent and desirable, is just not to test either on humans or animals, okay?
More information.
Yeah, okay, come.
Wouldn't you be better off testing on humans and animals? Even though you don't like it personally, it is actually helping more humans and animals than it's hurting.
Well, I guess you can say that you just would have to test on effect. What you're implying, I assume, is non-consenting humans or humans of lesser capacity, that we have to accept that we do on that. But that generates a really negative social outlook, I think. I mean, a society, there does come a point where you have to say the conclusion of this argument is just not acceptable. In a society where people in a persistent vegetative state are experimented upon without consent of their family, without any implication of consent on their part, I think it's just, I don't want that in my society. Okay? If you do, then vote against proposition.
More information.
No, thank you. Okay, so that's the moral side. We want to have a morally consistent framework, and we want that to be the basis of our legislation. And the only morally consistent and desirable outcome is to ban testing on animals and people, okay? Then there's the pragmatic side, which has been argued, about whether the desirability of alternatives and the existence of legislation makes us happy about this. Well, on the legislation point, which Charlie also addressed, I don't think that lessening a harm, just as I recently said about cognitive capacity, I don't think lessening a harm justifies the remaining harm, okay? That's kind of a specious argument. Just because we're trying to minimize harm doesn't mean that that harm is inherently justified any more than it was before he said that. Okay, as for alternatives, as JT said, people don't currently do this because they don't have to, because our legislation protects animal research. If you ban animal research, they'll have to develop research, okay? They'll have to develop new alternatives. and that we can send, as JT said again, a very strong signal to our society that we do not want discrimination on any form, whether it's species, racist, or classist, okay? So we end up, with this piece of legislation, with a morally consistent legal framework, okay? That's good. We like that because it makes it much easier to judge our concerns. We generate scientific innovation by incentivizing research into new pathways, and we also set a strong social example to the rest of the world and to our own society. So please, vote for a society which takes its ethics seriously, votes to ban all forms of animal research. Thank you very much.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here and to be the last speaker and to kind of sum up what we've been talking about. Well, we've got a really interesting debate here about animal research and whether it should be banned or not. And I think we've had good arguments on both sides, but I want to conclude. I want to show you by the conclusion of the opposition that actually the benefits of banning this, banning all forms of animal research are way lower than its cost. So if we stay with the status quo, we will actually have a way better progression of society and medicine and benefit both animals and people. So let's address some of the points that have been made by the opposition first. On the one hand, we had the strong signal to society. If we say that speciesism is bad, well, let's just follow that through. We're using a kind of moral framework here. That's the main argument, I would say, by the proposition, that we're using this moral framework where everybody is equal, as in everybody being animals, as in a rat next to me, imagine that, being equal to me. Obviously, I mean, we had the comparison to black people, which was quite well made by one of my previous speakers, that we had this thinking before, and that's what worries us, okay? That we might be wrong about this. We might be wrong in saying this rat is not equal, and we might be wrong in saying that we do go into jail for setting for killing a baby, but we don't go into jail for setting a trap for a mouse in our kitchen which poos in our cupboard, and we kill it for that, okay? So we kill animals for pooing in our kitchen. We kill animals for food, which is not necessary, okay? So we have to think about the scale here as well. We killed 6,000 animals in our lifetime for food. In our lifetime, we killed 4 animals, 4 mice, because obviously I think there's a difference between a cow and a mouse as well. I mean, that's arguable, okay, so let's not go into that. But in our lifetime, 4 mice and 1 fish and 1 rat dies on average, okay? So there are some monkeys in there, but actually 97% of all animals used in animal research are mice and rats, with majority, and the rest are fish and birds. So, okay, we've had that moral framework, which isn't really consistent with our society, and we're kind of proposing this and saying that it's going to send a strong signal to society. It's going to send a strong signal that we're the most ridiculous hypocrites there are. We're not. No, thank you. We're using animal research as a way to benefit both humans and animals. We are killing thousands of animals just because we like food. I mean, we can go into a debate about whether we need meat, no thank you, but we don't actually, and that is proven. I don't want to get into that. So, also we've been talking about rights of animals. So what are rights? Rights are a result of utilitarian moral frameworks, which I would like to argue, because rights are a result of the best way that we can possibly live with each other. If people have rights and responsibility, that leads to us living a better life and there being greater happiness overall. No, thank you. So we have also. I would like to point out that the opposition has very well mentioned that we have. Let me try how to put this the best way. We have. If we are in a lab, we will have the same suffering and pain as an animal, but we will also be thinking, I want to go outside, I want to do this, I want to do that. But actually the rats that are in those laboratories, no thank you, the main issue we've had was with their suffering. But this suffering is reduced, and that's why I want to go to the main things. Why we need animal research and how we do animal research. We need animal research, as my first speaker has very well pointed out, because it is saving hundreds and thousands of human lives and animal lives. We have all our knowledge of how to have brain operations on the human heart, operations on living organisms, so what was that? Meat that is produced in the laboratory, on living organisms with a beating heart. Yeah, there is a difference to that, and so we need it because there are these, and that kind of links in with how we do it. There are these 3 R's, which are kind of the underlying moral principle of animal research. We need to reduce the animals that, and these are actually put into practice, and they're a consequence of the laws that are put in. We need to reduce the animals we use in general. We need to reduce the number of animals we use. So every animal that is used in animal research, there's a justification for that, and that kind of rules out all your moral argument. And we need the number. The number needs to be justified. Any number needs to be justified, and we need to reduce the harm of the animals. And there's no further benefit in banning, because all the arguments are already considered in the current status quo. Thank you very much.
I remember I wanted it.
Yeah, but basically we're going to have a little Q&A session in here. If anyone wants to ask any questions in the audience, obviously there were a few points of information that did want to come out. So,
should we have a vote first?
Yes. Yeah, let's do the vote first. So can everyone who would now vote in favour of the proposition, please raise your hands. No, you're not. Well, again, everyone who would vote against the proposition, please raise your hands. Okay, so we've gone from 3 for and 8 against to 4 for and 5 against. Read into that what you will, some people left.
Can I just say that in the other YouTube videos, or the other debates online, there has not yet been an increase of that scale towards the 4 proposition.
I'll take that.
There were some people from the audience that left.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Because they couldn't bear the arguments. Because they were just ridiculous.
Yeah, so I was texting them like, your mum's in trouble.
Right, I'd like to thank everyone for their attendance here and for speaking.
Especially to Joe, Paul and Naomi, who came on very short notice.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So are there any questions from the audience? You can direct to anyone of us can answer, or anything that struck you as didn't get addressed, or go on then, Miles, you seem to be...
If not animals,
Maybe we
and
should
not
have a
humans,
representative from each
It's
side
your
of
right.
them.
who?
Come on, Schafranek.
Yes.
So when you're saying if not animals,
If not humans, who?
they're not. So animal research is a very small part of medical research as a whole. We're saying that by banning animal research, we will replace it with a new industry that invests in newer technologies, such as like we were talking about soft tissue, bioculture, chemical compounds. So,
Can I come in here?
Yeah, sure.
Just there, because this already actually exists. So most of the research is done on these tissues, and only in cases where it can be completely justified by, and this needs to be addressed to an ethical panel, where it can completely be justified. That's when you're allowed to use an animal for your research. So you can't just get up, okay, I'm going to use a guinea pig and just inject them with a disease.
Okay. I just want to know how the proposition would have applied to Thomas's response of this whole moral framework of yes, it's not okay to test on animals, but it's okay to eat them.
well, yeah. So there's 2 points to that. First of all, my point of information was going to be why using society as a moral framework, not the moral framework as the moral framework. And the response to vegetarianism is brilliant, because on our side we're saying cruelty and speciesism is a really bad thing. Therefore, we completely advocate a move towards vegetarianism and a cut down of meat consumption. It's only on our side is that realised, because by investing in these new technologies, we use the example of the burger that was cultivated in a lab, in Switzerland or wherever it was. And the fact that you're channeling all this money from animal research into these other technologies means the realization of that on a mass production scale comes about much quicker as a result of introducing this legislation, which means we have artificial meat quicker, which means we cut down meat production where we're killing animals, which is why on our side we actually save more animals, and on your side you don't.
Can I also say something?
Yes.
Okay, I'm just going to stand and face you, but yeah. In our research, we also found out that for every calorie that we gain from eating an animal, the animal takes up to 10 calories from vegetation. So if we totally stop eating meat, we'd actually get rid of kind of meat consumption and be able to feed human beings, to which there's already a surplus of about 10 billion food, which we could feed 7 billion people with. So there's people starving. So we don't actually need animals. And that's the point we didn't really get to flesh out. So we could link to the bigger points about deforestation and methane production and CO2 gases. And it's only on us that when you start channeling the money towards that alternative form of research, that do you get more artificial substitute? Do you cut down on your reliance for meat? Which, because I knew they were going to go like.
So I would like to say that I make two distinct arguments on that. Like one, because your argument that sends a strong preset to the
it's a society about kind of
just society. But then I said that is the biggest hypocritical move you could make as a government, because if you say that something which is so beneficial to both animals and humans, you ban that, but you don't ban eating it for pleasure, then I think there's a big difference there. So
I think the distinction there is if you ban eating meat, like tens of millions of people die from like malnourishment. So that there is a difference between phasing out animal research.
There's already a surplus of food now. The problem is not the amount of food. The problem is distribution.
Yeah, so you have to sort of, but like, so the
if we didn't have animal research, there would be thousands of people more who would die from malaria and cancer and diabetes and acid.
Okay, Diana, you had hand up for a while.
Yeah, well, I was just wondering whether you managed to collect any evidence on what would be the benefit to society from banning the consumption of meat in terms of health. I'm just wondering
whether health benefits.
Because
I've done like quite a lot of independent research, because I am like mostly vegan. Actually, I've got some people who disagree with me and say I'm not vegan because I eat meat 3 times a year. But that's not good.
Is it artificial meat a credible substitute for?
Well, it could probably potentially be, but we don't need meat anyway, so we don't really need a substitute for meat other than for the taste and for the kind of desire that people have for meat. As a kind of, the nutritional value isn't important. Like it's not. That's not what we don't need the meat for nutritional value. The meat, all the nutritional value that is in meat, you can get through plant-based diet. That's been like there's a lot of research going into that, and the thing is it is quite difficult because you actually need to work out what you eat and that you need to get all your vitamins and all. But for example, protein is one of the main things that's just ridiculous. You get all your protein from plant sources. I mean, if I can give you the sites to research that and show you the statistics. I obviously don't know them all.
The good thing about this debate, if we agree that more vegetarianism is a good thing, then what we're showing is that on our side of the house, we get more vegetarianism as a result of banning animal research, because we're researching into other alternatives. Whereas on this side of the house, like the status quo, just keeping the status quo doesn't change people's attitudes towards meat. Whereas on our side, on one side, we set a very strong precedence against speciesism. So if we're banning against animals, then you have the idea, you just said, well, we want to eat less meat because if we're not going to kill them, then it's a bit like we shouldn't eat them. So you're encouraging vegetarianism there, and also as well you're speeding up the production of artificial substitutes. So on 2 counts, on our side of the house, we are decreasing meat consumption, and on their side of the house, it's the status quo. So there's not even a trade-off. It's on our side, there is less meat consumption, and on this side, we have the same thing.
It's an economic argument, and I like it. But you've got it all wrong. Basically, so you want to reduce vegetarianism?
No, we want to increase vegetarianism.
You want to increase vegetarianism, reduce consumption of meat. Okay. Do that by incentivizing research into artificial meats. That's great. With tax breaks, with, I don't know, like government funds. But don't do it by banning animal research, which creates medicine to save lives.
No, it's not the purpose. It's just another byproduct of why it's just a byproduct of. We've given you reasons why you should follow this motion, and this is just like another positive externality of that.
No, it's not. It's not a positive externality.
Why?
Well, the negative externalities is so huge that if you can really consider like making people vegetarian to be a good thing, then just
it's not really a relevant positive externality. Like I don't think any people are gonna start becoming vegetarian just because there's a ban on animal research. I think you're
animals into the market to be eaten.
So yeah.
Any other points?
I would like to actually add to that one thing which hasn't really come out is that you've been saying a lot about all these other methods, but how can we justify like taking away this extra step that might save? So I'm not 100% sure that in the next 50 years, before those methods have developed enough for us to be able to use them in an efficient way that is similar to using actually real life proper animals. And how can we justify taking this possibility away? That is a possibility of saving not only humans but animals as well with major diseases.
You've sort of taken the inverse of what I wanted to say, but I think your sort of team hinged upon the sort of age-old utilitarian principle more than most, and Soila in particular mentioned it, and I wanted to know because that doesn't fit well with me. It doesn't seem to be sufficient because on those grounds alone I can justify gang rape. And I want to know at what point does the sort of the suffering minority demand a response for us to say, no, this is not enough, let's stop this.
Right. I can answer this. Basically, well, that is where we go into utilitarianism, like really difficult. But because in utilitarianism, it's basically saying that also suffering is worse than like pleasure. So one person's suffering is more negative like than the other person's pleasure. So we always consider suffering a lot harder. Sorry?
But okay, so like if you're going to differentiate,
how does it apply in these cases?
Then you have to.
In terms of the animal suffering of an animal, at what point does its pain and sort of the number quantify us to say to demand a reaction from our society?
Because you have to accept speciesism as part of your argument. You have to accept if you're going to take a utilitarian point of view. Well,
yeah, we have to take into account species.
You have to be speciesist.
Not necessarily.
Yes.
If you say animals and humans are equal,
and
you're still going to say that some animal research and human research is beneficial to the aggregate animals and humans.
Well, and we gave you a number of 150 million animals a year. And
isn't that where my point comes in, that the animal in the laboratory will suffer less than the human in the laboratory?
Well, it's inconsistent on 2 points. One, like you're taking a species point of view. If you want to take a species point of view, you can do that. The second thing is, well, if you say they're equal, then you have to weigh up the numbers. Now, like that's not going to sit well with a lot of people. But if we give you the numbers, 115 million animals die every year in animal research, you have to come back with an equal statistic that is larger than that of the amount of humans it saves.
Yeah,
and
the number of people that die of cancer and AIDS.
But it's incremental.
That's already been.
It's incremental. It's 150 million every single year. And animal research is a very small part of medical research. And there's any way you can claim that animal research saves 115 million people every single year.
Well, that's nowhere near.
Think about it over time. Penicillin was used.
I think we will have some good information from the back there.
Yes.
Can you please?
Well, yeah, I just wanted to throw a couple of points
Would you mind coming
into
up
the
front?
discussion. I can. I mean, I don't have all the facts and figures for the UK because I'm Swiss, as you can hear. And but it was quite interesting to hear all the arguments for and against. I think it's probably how we, the industry, would argue for. But I think just a couple of things to consider. I think first of all, the industry is under huge pressure. Pharmaceutical companies, it takes about 10 to 15 years to develop a drug, so it's extremely expensive. And as you probably know, there haven't been a lot of very innovative developments in the past. So pharma is under pressure. A lot of reorganizations are closing a lot of sites. So as you can imagine, animal research is very expensive. If you want to do research on a, let's say, on primate, which is very rare, as you've heard as well, but we still have to do it. A primate costs around $500 US. So if we could do without, we would do it immediately. Also, well, if you go into mice, obviously it's a little less costly, but still for us, if we could do without,
it would be hugely beneficial. Unfortunately, we can't. I'm not, for example, a scientist, and I also struggle to see animals locked up, and especially I think if you see primates, they're very interactive. It's hard to see, but at the end of the day, we also see a lot of patients that survive because of these drugs. So yeah, it's at the end it is, what are the benefits and what is the cost to that? And I think it's a valid discussion that you should have. And I think, as I said, there is no alternative. For example, to the metabolism, like how you digest things. There are a lot of alternatives to do in vitro, but for example, how you digest a drug, that is unfortunately not yet possible to do in vitro. So, again, if we could, we would. And then what else? What else were you discussing? What were the questions?
Well, there's a lot of philosophy in there, but there wasn't much science. We should have probably incorporated a bit more.
Well, one thing I was kind of interested in is that so this justification progress that our team talked about quite a lot. How does that actually work? How does that actually work out, and what people actually decide whether you're allowed to use animals in your research?
You mean legally?
Yeah.
Well, we have to. Whenever you want to do animal research, you have to get that approved by committees. And once it's approved, you say, we have a study of, 500 mice for X drug, and then you get that approved, and then you go for it. It's a highly regulated industry, so you have to follow certain practices, how you can do that. You have obviously your sponsors coming in, sponsors the clients, like the big pharma for us. And I think one point that I also thought would be important to mention, and obviously I speak more on behalf of the industry, but what we always say is, we have a very strong interest in making sure that those animals are actually doing well, because if the animals are stressed, research is bad, and our clients are not going to be satisfied with the research we're doing.
And it's not like they're bored and going crazy, right? Because there are ways in which they can be stimulated and in which they enjoy their time.
Yeah, it's hard to say if they enjoy the time.
Yeah,
but
it comes back to John Gray's argument about just lessening the harm doesn't discount the overall harm that is incurred, but it's nice to know.
Yeah, and there are big differences, right? For example, if I just went to a facility in Germany, we have actually trainers for coming from Sweden, who they have a playing room. For example, we do a lot of primate research there. They have playing rooms, and they'll go out to those playing rooms. They interact with their trainers. We actually went as far as we don't have to kind of catch the primates anymore. We kind of let them out of the cages. They go on the chair themselves, where they can be dosed. I think the industry is doing a lot of things to improve their lives, but is it, as they're free? It's hard to discuss, and sometimes I think, well, if you watch those National Geographic channels and see what animals do to each other, is that very nice? No, but, does that justify what we do to them? I think it's, as you said, an ethical discussion, and, the industry, I think, is doing a lot to do it as best as we can. Obviously, there's always mistakes.
I think that's probably a really good point to end on.
Mm-hmm.
So, thank you very much, Frank. Thank you to everyone.